Well, good evening. Welcome, everybody. So get comfortable. I think folks are still moseying in, as we like to say, and that hopefully will continue to happen. I am Ann Hodges-Koppel. I am the resigned Bishop Suffragan of the Diocese of North Carolina. We don't talk about retired. We just talk about, I'm not going to do that anymore. So I did my Mary Poppins thing and said, I've done my work in the Diocese of North Carolina, but I'm still a bishop and I get to do things all over the church. But I love doing things at this church. And really, anytime that you are at an Episcopal church, you're really at a family reunion, right? Because there's just one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And so that's why it's so nice to look out here this evening and see friends from all over, from years and decades, from different geographies, different churches, and all because, well, I won't say all because, but I will say deeply because God called Lauren, and Lauren had a hold on the rest of us. What a guy, what a man, what a family. And then we were so delighted to know that his family, via a very treasured nephew, would also say, let's keep the voice of Lauren in the lore. And we're gathered here tonight to hear some more about that. But my colleague, the Reverend Brooks Grebner, is going to say more about what's brought us here tonight. I get to say things like where the bathrooms are, because, you know, that's pretty important. So the ladies' room is through this door that way. The men's room is through this door that way. I think I could have been an airline flight attendant. There's water in any of those places. There'll be a reception following. Stay comfortable, stay tuned, sit back, and enjoy, because this is really going to be a very special evening. Brooks Grebner, please, take it away.
Thank you, Bishop Ann. Bishop Ann was just reminding me that our time here at St. Luke's goes back to 1985. And I want to say again, it's a joy always to be here. This is the church that sponsored me for ordination, so it's always great to be back. I'm Brooks Grebner. I'm the historiographer of the Diocese of North Carolina, and I want to thank this church for hosting and for welcoming us. Want to thank Babs Wise, Lauren's daughter, for all the work she did in hosting this evening's event. And this event is also sponsored by two organizations of the diocese, the History and Archives Committee of the diocese, and I want to recognize our archivist, Lynn Hoke, who's sitting there. Lynn, wave your arms. And Lynn has brought some materials that you can pick up and look at related to our history, and also sponsored by our diocesan Racial Justice and Reconciliation Committee, and the co-chairs are here. I want to recognize Kathy Reimer-Searles in the back at her table. Wave, Kathy. And Kathy is a member of this congregation. And then Lou Myers. Lou, thank you for being here, and thank you for sponsoring. We have two authors of this fine book that we're celebrating this evening. One of them is here in person, Mike Martinez, and he'll get up and talk specifically about the book in just a few minutes. But the other author of this book is Lauren Mead, and I want to introduce Lauren, and then we're going to show a video of Lauren. I first got to know Lauren Mead through his writings for the Alban Institute. For many of us in parish ministry in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Lauren's writings and the work of the Alban Institute guided our understanding of congregational dynamics. In the 1990s, I had the opportunity to meet Lauren in person. And in 2017, he was kind enough to accept my invitation to come to St. Philip's in Durham and participate in a day-long program highlighting the civil rights era in our diocese. From 1958 to 1968, Lauren was rector of the Church of the Holy Family in Chapel Hill and active in the civil rights movement. He left Holy Family to found the Alban Institute, a think tank for studying congregational life. In 2017, Lauren was already racked with pain from cancer, and he came to Durham at great personal sacrifice because he thought it was important to make known his testimony to the cause of racial reconciliation and justice. A video recording of that day exists, and I want you to see what Lauren had to say because it speaks to our ongoing work to counter racism in our church, and because it has a direct bearing on the book that he started and that his nephew, Mark Martinez, has now completed, and whose publication we celebrate this evening. Because this video is excerpted from a day-long event, there are several places where Lauren makes reference to people and programs that require some clarifying explanation. One is this mention of Father Joe Green. You can see Joe next to Lauren, there with the microphone in his hand. Joe Green spoke directly before Lauren that day. Joe Green was an African-American priest who served as chaplain at St. Augustine's School in Raleigh in the late 1950s and early 60s. You need to know that Joe Green was the first black student to graduate from the School of Theology at the University of the South, which was previously a lily-white institution. And you'll get to hear more about the University of the South when Mike gets up to speak. You also need to know that Joe Green hosted the founding meeting of an organization to which both he and Lauren belonged, called the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, or ESCRU for short. ESCRU was a coalition of black and white Episcopalians who were concerned about the slow pace of desegregation in the church. It lasted for 10 years from 1959 to 1969, and it was especially active in the early 1960s when it conducted prayer pilgrimages to segregated congregations in the South. You've heard of sit-ins. Well, ESCRU held kneel-ins. I think the rest of the video will speak for itself. Here's Lauren Mead. For those of you who let me have a show of hands. For how many of you is that the first time you've encountered Lauren Mead? A remarkable, remarkable figure. And that testimony still rings true, doesn't it? Now, when Lauren passed away in 2018, he left an unfinished manuscript. He was working on that at the time that he appeared in that video. And I'm just so pleased that his nephew, Mike Martinez, has completed that book, and that's what we're celebrating tonight. So Mike, please come forward and say more about this project and fulfilling our ministry, or thy ministry. Thank you, Mike.
Good evening. Brooks has told me I have to keep it to 25 minutes, so I've got my timer on here. Every time I practice it in the dog pen with my dogs, I never get it that low. It's usually 30 minutes. My neighbors, I know, think I'm crazy. He's out there preaching to the dogs again. But anyway, I want to echo my thanks to the sponsors for this evening, Brooks for showing us that great video. I had not seen that. Also to my cousin Babs for handling all of the work behind the scenes and getting the books here. So thank you so much for that. I have to tell you folks, I feel a little bit like an imposter because I had to be dragged, figuratively speaking, kicking and screaming to this project. Lauren wrote me a letter about 10 years ago, and he said, I'm working on this project about 3 Episcopal clergymen in 19th century South Carolina, and I am old, I mean capital O-L-D. And he said, I don't think I can finish this. Would you take it up if I can't finish it? Well, I was very flattered to be asked, but I'm trained as a lawyer. Lauren said he's a recovering racist. I'm a recovering lawyer now. I've retired from that. But that's the world that I know. I've occasionally dipped my toe into a little bit of history, but it's Whig history, W-H-I-G. I write about political institutions. So the idea that I would write a book about Episcopal clergymen, it just seemed a bridge too far. So I politely declined, and I didn't think any more about it. But those of you who knew Lauren, you know he can be very persuasive. And so he kept after me. And so here we are. So the book is called Fulfill Thy Ministry. And you'll notice there's a drawing on the cover. This drawing is from 1883. It's called The Ruins of Charleston. And it shows Charleston the way it looked after the war. There was also a devastating fire in 1861 in Charleston that had nothing to do with the war. So this is the ruins. And since each of the ministers had a connection to Charleston, I thought it was appropriate for the cover. In terms of the title, one of the ministers, Anthony Toomer Porter, said in his autobiography that this was his favorite verse. And since it seemed to be appropriate to all 3 of the clergymen, and to Lauren as well, I decided that I would use Fulfill Thy Ministry as the title of the book. The young Lauren Mead wouldn't have needed me to complete this book for him. I actually gave a book talk at the college where I teach near Atlanta back in April. And we had 35 students show up. That shows you what extra credit will do for you. But anyway, during the Q&A section, one of the students asked me, do you think this would have been a much different book if Lauren had lived and he had written it? And I said, oh, yes, there's definitely. Lauren wrote many books, and they were very church-focused. And when he was talking to me about doing this, I sort of became Porky Pig. I did that. That's all, folks. I was like, look, Lauren, what I was afraid of is this was going to be deep theology. It was going to be 3 Episcopal clergymen talking about Scripture. And I would very quickly get in over my head. And he said, no, that's not what this is about. You know, I had this vision. I saw the great Southern novelist Pat Conroy give a talk back in the 80s. I was one of like 200 people in the audience. And he had this great story. He called it Dueling Bibles. And he said when his elderly relatives would get together, they would fight with each other using the Bible. And, it would be Old Testament versus New Testament, and, dueling Bibles. And I thought, I'm going to get into this, and I'm going to be delving into Scripture as each of these men justifies their position based on passages from the Bible. And I said, I'm not the person to do that. But again, Lauren was persuasive. We had a Christmas party that our family had in Washington, D.C. at the end of 2017. This photo was snapped of us. This is the last time that I saw Lauren. Now, we both knew he had cancer. He was 87, pushing 88. You don't have to be a doctor to see where this is headed. We're sitting here. This is probably the last 5 minutes we're ever going to see each other. This is my 55th birthday, by the way. What do you say to someone when you know I'm probably never going to see you again? Well, what Lauren says is, I wish you would reconsider the book. And so I said the words that sealed my fate. I said, well, if you can't get anybody else. I thought surely there would be some historiographer in the church, and I'm talking to you, Brooks, somebody other than me, the recovering lawyer, would do this. Well, then that was in December. Lauren passed away the next May, and I flew up to the funeral, and after the funeral, several people came up to me and said, we are so glad you are doing this book. It meant so much to Lauren. Well, at that point, am I going to be the shit that says, no, I'm not doing it? I mean, I don't think so. So that's how I got into this book. The problem was, you mentioned he had an unfinished manuscript. That's being generous. He had unfinished note cards, okay? And I asked Walter, Lauren's son, send me whatever material that's around, and you sent me 5 huge crates of books. And then I had to do some archival research. And I sort of felt like, the story, it's not true, but the story of Michelangelo, somebody happens upon him, and he's furiously chiseling at this block of marble. And somebody says, what are you doing? And he says, there's an angel in the marble, and I am releasing it. Well, I had this big box of material. I had all this archival research, and I thought, somewhere in there, there's a narrative, and I have to find it and release it. And I tell you, I had a lot of doubts. Then, as the years went on and I began to dig into this, I began to see why it was so compelling to Lauren. He found 3 men. I would call them emblematic. 3 men that didn't just represent their own lives, but they represented the lives of all clergymen in that time and place. I would call them the radical, the moderate, and the conservative. And looking at their lives, looking at how they responded to race, to slavery, to emancipation, to Reconstruction, to Jim Crow, I think has a lot to teach us. And so a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. I fell in love with the material, and I began to see why Lauren did too. So let me see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're hanging in there. Let me talk about each of the 3 men very quickly. And the book, of course, delves into this in a lot of detail. The first gentleman, I will call him the radical. His name was Peter Faso Stevens. He was born in Florida in 1830. His father, who seems to have been something of a rogue, was trying to make a living on a sugarcane plantation near Tallahassee. He wasn't making a go of it. There were Indian attacks, so he sent his family to Pendleton, South Carolina. If you know the geography of South Carolina, Pendleton is a little town between Anderson and Greenville. And the family, there were lots of family there. Stevens turned out to be a very bright child. He actually went to school, and this is before universal compulsory education. So getting your child in the 1830s to go to school was a remarkable thing. He went to the South Carolina Military Academy, the Citadel, at the age of 15. He was so gifted. He was number one in his class, but he was so gifted that while he was still a student there, he also taught mathematics as one of the faculty. He graduated at 19. He did a little bit of work as an engineer, and then he came back to the Citadel where he taught. And then at the age of 29, he became the superintendent or president. This picture on the left here is the picture of him about the time that he became the superintendent of the Citadel. He was still the superintendent when he played a small part, but an important part in the history of the Civil War. In early 1861, the Buchanan administration, Lincoln has won the election, but he's not been inaugurated. So James Buchanan is still president. He sends a ship, the Star of the West, to reprovision Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. When the governor of South Carolina hears about this, he orders that the Citadel cadets go to Morris Island across the harbor from Fort Sumter. And he tells them that if any hostile ships come into the harbor, they are to fire. Well, sure enough, here comes the ship, and they fire on the ship. Well, they take a couple of shots. The captain of the ship turns around and sails out of the harbor and into the pages of history. Some historians consider this to be the opening shots of the Civil War. And if that's the case, Peter Stevens was the man who ordered the shots to be taken. He stays in the Army. He resigns as the Citadel superintendent, but he stays in the Army, and he is sent to Virginia, and he becomes part of the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee, and he's wounded at the Battle of Antietam, or as we Southerners say, Sharpsburg. Right? He decides then that he is going to resign his commission. He has already taken holy orders, and he is going to now be an Episcopal priest just outside of Charleston. And I would argue this is the pivotal moment in his life. This is when things change for him. He is given the absolute worst duty, the scut work. A lot of the planters in South Carolina were Episcopalians. And if you had a really large plantation, you would have a slave chapel. And so you would have an itinerant preacher that would move around from slave chapel to slave chapel on a Sunday. If you were a young clergyman, this is not the assignment you want. But this is the assignment that Stevens got, and he seems to have taken to it. And I think what happens is he develops a level of empathy that you don't see. I think Lauren talked about the scalawags, the whites who become, helpful to the North at the end of the war. Well, I think this is sort of what happens to Stevens. He becomes empathetic. And so at the end of the Civil War, about 90% of the black communicants left the Episcopal Church of South Carolina. They said, hey, now that we're free, we don't have to worship in the churches that were pushed on us by our slave masters. Stevens says we can bring some of these folks back into the church if we provide an atmosphere where they can make some of their own decisions. So now, you're not going to have an integrated church. That's a bridge too far. But Stevens says, let's have black deacons, black priests. Let's have black bishops. Well, this was unheard of. Talk about heresy. Actually, the Bishop of South Carolina, beginning in 1871, Bishop Howe, was somewhat sympathetic to this. However, the laity was not. And so ultimately, the bishop tells Stevens, no, we're not doing that. And so Stevens makes the hardest decision of his life. He abandons the church. And he joins the Reformed Episcopal Church, and he spends the next almost 35 years of his life preaching and ministering to people of color. And when he dies in 1910, all of his pallbearers are blacks. So that's our radical. This is him at the time of the war. This is him late in his life. These photographs are all undated, and to my knowledge, these two photographs have never been published before. I stumbled upon them in the Spartanburg County Library in the papers of the Stevens family. The second man I want to talk about is Anthony Toomer Porter. Porter is our moderate. He's born on a rice plantation in Georgetown County, South Carolina, in 1828. His father is a prominent planter and South Carolina legislator, but he dies when Toomer is less than a year old, leaving a wife and 5 children, 2 of whom died in adolescence. By the time he is 20 years old, he is the head of this rice plantation. His mother's health is bad, and he takes over. He decides, however, that he feels spiritually hollow, that he needs to answer the Lord's call, and he needs to become a clergyman. And so he decides he's going to get rid of his rice plantation, and he is going to sell his 80 enslaved persons. He says in his autobiography, "I could have emancipated them, but that would have been wrong." Because what else would they have done? They had no way to make a living. They had nobody to take care of them. They would have gone on to a much worse life. And so I sold them to a master who promised to keep the family together. I find this a little self-serving. Am I the only one that sees this that? Not only that, but he acts like, being, the planter on a rice plantation is a nice thing. The worst thing an enslaved person could have, the absolute worst duty, was to work on a rice plantation. Because rice requires a lot of water. So if you're an enslaved person on a rice plantation, you spend your time hip deep in water. There's water moccasins, there are leeches, you've got ticks on you, you've got dengue fever, yellow fever, malaria. If you live to be 30 and you're an enslaved person working on a rice plantation, you are ancient. That is old, because the mortality rate is horrific. So this idea that he's a nice, benevolent planter, I don't know, that seems a little self-serving. But he takes holy orders in 1854. He becomes the rector of the Church of the Holy Communion in Charleston. The church is failing at that point. He manages to turn it around. And then he does the thing that he is still remembered for today, especially in the low country of South Carolina. He becomes an educator. He starts a series of schools. He starts a school for young women to become seamstresses. He starts a school after the war for the freed people. And he starts a school for young white men who had been in the Confederate Army. It later becomes the Porter Military Academy, and today it is known as the Porter Gowd School in Charleston. It's a prep school for the Charleston elite to try to get their kids into the Ivy League schools. So Porter becomes an educator. He becomes an Episcopal clergyman. In 1878, he also becomes the rector of St. Mark's, which is a black Episcopal church in Charleston. And these are photos. This is one of the last photos taken of him in his life. But I think this is the turning point for Porter, because now he is someone who, I would call it benign paternalism. He doesn't have the same level of empathy that we see in Stevens, but he is empathetic from afar. He does not believe that black communicants should be ministers or deacons or bishops. They need proper training, they need to be shown the way. And white church leaders will do that. So he's kind of the moderate for his day. When he died in 1902 at the age of 74, he was beloved in the white and the black community. I think, however, to me, the most interesting of these men because he is so different from our time and place, is William Porcher DuBose. Of the three men, he was by far the best known in his life. He became a well-known theologian in his day. He was to the manor born, quite literally. He was born on a plantation. His father actually owned 2 adjoining plantations. And his family had hundreds of slaves. He was sent to the best schools. He, too, went to the Citadel. He was first in his class for 2 of the 4 years that he was there. And in the war, he served under Stevens in the Eastern Theater, and the 2 men became friends. Now, here's where his story changes. After the war, he takes holy orders in 1866. This is important. Stevens took holy orders in 1861, right before the war really picks up. And Porter took holy orders in 1854 during the antebellum era. But DuBose becomes a priest at exactly the time when Reconstruction is there. And there's this great fear that the freed people are going to be marauding through the neighborhoods. There's going to be a kind of race war. And so he's got a growing young family. He is frightened of the very people that Stevens and to some extent Porter are ministering to. He then takes the duties. He becomes the pastor at Trinity Church in Abbeville in 1868. 1868, an incredibly important year. This is the year in which the South Carolina State Constitution is rewritten, and it's becoming much more progressive toward people of color. And white conservatives are outraged by this. 1868, this is the year that the Ku Klux Klan expands into South Carolina. And the worst violence in all of South Carolina in Reconstruction is in Abbeville in 1868, at precisely the moment that DuBose becomes a clergyman there. And then in 1871, he is asked to be the chaplain at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. And so he moves over there. He later becomes the founder of the theology department there and becomes a beloved teacher. He writes 7 books. 5 of them are books of theology that are widely regarded as among the greatest books of theology written in the Episcopal Church in North America in the 19th century. He is a beloved figure, but he is also a man who is, think about this, he's surrounded at the University of the South. University of South, most of the administrators and teachers at the beginning are ex-Confederate military leaders. And when they founded the university, they said, we are specifically founding this university to propagate the values of the Old South. Students still wore the Confederate gray until the 1890s. They displayed the Confederate battle flag for decades. So when you talk about fulfill thy ministry, which ministry are you talking about? Stephen sees that as ministering to the poor and the downtrodden people of color. Porter sees his job as sort of treating these people like children, and he's like a benevolent father figure. But DuBose wants to have nothing to do with them. He is ministering to the poor, defeated, lost cause whites who feel that they got a raw deal at the end of the Civil War. And so he would argue, I'm fulfilling my ministry. He just sees his duty in a different way. In an unpublished autobiography that he wrote that is in the University of North Carolina Southern History Papers, he is reflecting on that period of Reconstruction, and he says, the Ku Klux Klan was an inspiration of genius. The only way to really govern social relations in that dark period of the 1860s. So 3 men who all knew each other, who came from similar backgrounds, who came to holy orders, who saw themselves as good, God-fearing, God-loving Christian gentlemen with very different understandings of their role. And I think this is what Lauren found so compelling. You know, we can say God is perfect, but human beings are not. And we see what we need to do, we see our duty in very different ways, and I think that is reflected in the story of these three men. So thank you. And I got it under 25. Yeah, any questions? I'm good. Don't be like my students. Okay, yeah.
Two questions. First of all, you mentioned that
DuBose, that's how he pronounced it, yeah.
DuBose and Stevens were friends during the war. I imagine as their paths diverged theologically later on, did they remain in contact? Do you have any records of letters between them as Stevens was beginning to think about
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll repeat it. He asked me, since Stevens and DuBose were friends during the war, but they had such different paths after the war, did they remain in contact? It's almost like I planted you, because that's actually in my 35-minute version of the talk, I covered this. Okay? I did find a letter. You know, there's very few times when you're doing archival research when you have the aha moment. But I was like, aha! And people in the library are like, oh, he snapped or something. I found a letter that DuBose wrote to Stevens in 1875, where he's saying, I understand from Bishop Howe that you plan to abandon your post. You and I are friends. I know there's a chasm between us. And I quote this letter in the book. This isn't a quote, it's the paraphrase. But there's a chasm between us, and I assume that it's because of race. Are we really going to allow such a minor thing to split us asunder? We don't have the letter that responds to that. But we do know that in other correspondence, Stevens references, this has pained me because it has cost me friendships. But I have to be true to myself and true to my God. Great question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Along the same vein, DuBose and Porter were both from Huguenot families.
Mm-hmm.
So did they have contact?
Well, all three of the men crossed paths at one time or another. I would have to say, when it comes to Porter, he knew the other men, but they were just colleagues. They weren't friends in any sense. And the friendship that Stevens and DuBose had was forged because of their time in uniform. Yeah. Walter.
Is Stevens still remembered in the Reformed Episcopal Church? What is their kind of historical sense of this period?
Yeah, great question. Is Stevens remembered? He is remembered. If you Google the Reformed Episcopal Church of South Carolina, some of the stuff that pops up, they mention him. He too was involved in educational efforts. The Citadel had been shuttered during the war, and there was a debate. Remember, the Citadel was an institution that was created specifically in response to a slave rebellion. And so there were some people at the end of the war as, do we really need the Citadel anymore because we don't have slavery anymore? So there was a big debate about whether or not we should open it up, and Stevens was one of the people pushing to open it. And so he was also very briefly a professor of mathematics at Claflin University, which is a historically black college in South Carolina. He pushed to open a school to train black bishops in the Reformed Church. So he is still remembered, to the extent that anybody remembers their history from the 19th century, he's still remembered in the Reformed Church, yeah. Yes, sir.
So your presentation to me has answered a question. That is, there is really a difference in the clergy and the teaching of the gospel on this side of the Mason-Dixon and on the other side of the Mason-Dixon, and now I know why.
Great question. Great. So, with Stevens, the only thing that he left was an unpublished, handwritten in pencil, I might add, autobiography that I found in his papers. And I wish I should have invited the archivist from the Spartanburg County Library, because he got an intern to actually go through and make a transcript. That intern deserves some sort of prize. But anyway, he never, in all of that, he mentions philosophy, he mentions history, he does not mention Scripture. So I can't tell you what specifically Stevens thought when it comes to actual, how does this root in Scripture. Some of the things that Porter said, he had a long, self-serving autobiography. And I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's sort of like wonderful things I've done in my life. I guess we would all write that if we were writing about our lives, right? We wouldn't want to write about all the horrible things we did. But anyway, he only touches on those things periodically. Du Bois was a theologian, and he wrote 5 books of theology, all of which I read with the help of many secondary sources. And I had a number of people read it behind me, including Brooks here. But I have a friend who's also has a divinity degree, and he read through it and all to make sure that I understood it. What I find interesting about Du Bois is that his area of expertise was exploring the life of Jesus Christ and Christ as a symbol to human beings. Now you see how interesting this becomes. Here's the guy that thinks the Ku Klux Klan is an inspiration of genius on one hand, and yet he's interested in the life of Christ on the other. Yeah. Well, I think also what happens too is, think about his circumstances. And I'm not trying to take up for him, but think about this. If you're born into a society that is a white supremacist society, and your parents, your church, your schools, your government, every single aspect of your life teaches you that white supremacy is God's plan. The question is not, why are you a white supremacist, but why would you not be? I mean, just think about that. In 1858, a famous South Carolina United States Senator, James Henry Hammond, gave a talk. It was called the Mudsill Speech. And what he said was, every great society is built on a mudsill. And what he meant was, white society where we have art and music and science and philosophy and all of those wonderful things, if you're going to have time to do that, you have to have people to clean your clothes and take care of your children and plant your crops and harvest your crops and throw out the waste and deal with the livestock, and those are the enslaved people. It's a self-serving rationalization for slavery. And so many of the folks in that society believed that that was just the way things are. Yes, sir.
Both his South Carolina upbringing and his experience in researching the book and these 3 clergymen in particular affected his own ministry in terms of civil rights and his service here at Chapel Hill. Could you or Brooks say a few words? I know it's a little bit off the top.
Let me just very quickly tell you my take, and then I'll turn the microphone over to, there are a number of folks here that might be able to address that. Loren, to me, because most of the time that I had a large connection with him, I was a child, and I knew he was this sort of revered figure, and so I kind of looked at him in awe, so which was why when he asked me to take over this project, I was both fearful and kind of flattered. But I really didn't know his ministry until much, much later. So I don't know if Brooks or Walter or Babs wants to address that. Chris, who's on the hot seat?
I'm the youngest of the 3 of us that are here. I think. Having these brothers, never mind. It's hard to really say what influence. I have a hard time with this because I was one of the younger ones, but Dad was, he was I don't know how to say, he was such a human that he related to each person individually. By the time he went to do the Alban Institute, he left being a parish priest in 1969. And so his ministry became helping people in various churches be better at what they did. And he believed that the importance of the church was the community. And that what we do when we go to church is we have a community. And that's what he was about, building and making better. And I think that's, guys, anybody else want to add to that, Walter?
Well, I think part of the couple of things that triggered Dad's interest in this topic, one was the discovery that Stevens actually had been the rector of the same church in Pinopolis, South Carolina. That was my dad's first assignment from his bishop. And later in life, as he began to understand, read into this life, he learned about his work in the Reformed Episcopal Church, and he'd realized there were Reformed Episcopal churches all over this particular area around Pinopolis. And he had never known or been told of the connection there, that this had kind of utterly dropped out of the memory of the white Episcopal Church in Pinopolis, which really, I think, helped him to see more clearly what kind of a blind spot that the sort of cultural prejudices and shaping created, that uncomfortable realities just didn't exist. But the other incident, which happened actually much later in the life of the South Carolina church, was in the 1930s. There was a bishop who actually, bishop of South Carolina, was ready to ordain blacks as priests in the Episcopal Church. And somebody walked into his office one day and shot him dead. And so, my dad, who was born in 1930, this was sort of in living memory. His father was a senior warden of the church. His mother was on all the diocesan committees and so on. So this was happening in circles where he lived. And I think the reality that for him, this, was still going on really helped begin to shape his, turn him into a scalawag bit by bit.
And by the way, Walter wrote the foreword to the book and talks about some of those same issues in there. Chris, did you want to say something?
Just a little bit. His mother and his father both were not from the South. So I think, and he was brought up by servants in the house who were African American, and he felt very close to them. He also felt very close to his minister, Joe Horner, who I think had similar liberal tendencies. And his father was involved in a human relations kind of a movement is too big a word, but connection in South Carolina, in the area of Florence where they were. So I think there were many things that made Dad feel a little bit different than the people around him. If that helps.
Yes, sir. There is not. The question he asked is, did Stevens, since he was not in favor of any sort of integration of the races, did any of that change over time? And the answer is, if it did, he didn't leave a record of it. We always have to be careful when you study the past that you don't use what historians call presentism when you look at the past through the eyes of the present. The idea that you would have mixed races in South Carolina in that era, I just think, even if you're the radical, you're not that radical. And in fact, in his handwritten autobiography, Stevens, at the beginning, and as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, oh, here comes the basic sort of Southern lost cause mythology. Slavery really wasn't the problem of the South. It was hoisted on us by England. It was hoisted on us by the Northerners who actually benefited from it. And we really didn't like it. And if the Northerners hadn't been so aggressive, we would have eventually gotten rid of slavery. That was the kind of standard Southern apologetics, after the war. So I never saw that movement. Yeah. When I got into this, he's asking the question about Reverend D's in the, 1950s. Yeah, was there a way to see from DuBose's theology up through the 1950s and D's? Yeah. Yeah. Brooks, you want to? Yeah.
So Jimmy Dees was the rector of our church in Statesville in the 1950s and early 1960s. He was one of the organizers of the White Citizens Council in North Carolina. And every time he came to diocesan convention, he was there to protest any effort, even the slightest effort, and Lauren explains that, even the slightest effort towards integration, desegregation in the church. Jimmy Dees was firmly against it. In 1963, when the Episcopal Church unequivocally took a stand for civil rights, Jimmy Dees left the Episcopal Church to found his own denomination, which he called the Anglican Orthodox Church. To that extent, I think Dees was like DuBose. He associated white supremacy with Orthodox Christianity. And there are remnants of the Anglican Orthodox Church scattered across North Carolina. Some of those attitudes are still there, and that's enough.
I was getting ready to say, too, that, the question of would this have been a different book if Lauren had lived, certainly it would have. One of the things he probably would have done, I guess we'll never know, but to make connections between these men in the 19th century and in the church later, I decided to forego doing that because I thought that for me, as I told Lauren when we were talking about this, I said, look, if it's a straight up history and I can tie it to the documents, I'm going to do that. But if you want me to try to extrapolate the lessons of this and apply it to things that occurred in the Episcopal Church in the 20th and 21st century, I'm not your guy, because I'm really going to get myself in a whole lot of trouble doing that. So what I tried to do is every opinion that I give in the book, I try to be able to tie it to a document, to either a primary source preferably, or certainly a secondary source. And you'll see, if you look at the book, I have a pretty thick bibliography because I wanted to make sure that I had these things documented. If anybody wants to go behind me and take the task of saying, hey, let's see how these folks apply in a later time, have at it. How are we on time? Are we ready for our reception? Or? Oh, wait, we got...
It's not a question, just a comment. I'm Lauren Mee, and I'm Chris's wife, so I knew Lauren Mee was my father-in-law, so I think you'd be very, very proud of what you've done and how you've taken it.
There was never one single moment. There were lots of moments where I'd say, okay, it's almost like a puzzle piece. I think I've put this piece together. Du Bois was the easy one because he had written books himself, and there's a lot written about him. Stevens was the hard one because very little was written about him. I had that moment where I found the correspondence, between Du Bois and Stevens, but most of it was just painstakingly saying this and this. And there were times when I thought, I don't know if Lauren would approve of this or not, but he's not here, and you just sort of have to do the best you can. So that's the story I think any historian has, is you have to try to piece it together and do the best you can. So thank you for that. I thought I saw one other hand back here, and then I'll.
I think my hand was involuntarily.
Okay.
It's a little too complicated. Could I talk with you just one-on-one?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I had a chance to talk to Lauren when he was here in 2017, and I had the feeling then that Pinopolis is at the
Yeah.
that was a crucial thing in this whole, because he was already talking about these three guys. But it had to, the nexus of it was his having been in Pinopolis, and it was like a place where this was coming together in his head. Even though he wasn't there now, he was
Yeah.
long gone. He'd been here and then he'd gone to
Yeah.
Washington. But part of him was Pinopolis, and these people, even if they'd never been there, they were somehow connected
Yeah.
to that town.
Yeah.
The ministry there.
And I think of the three.
Yeah, just on Pinopolis, he did used to talk about that quite a bit as affecting the way he thought about things. One of the early things he did there was they were still carrying the Confederate battle flag, and not a replica, an actual from the war flag in the processional in church.
Wow.
And he stopped that. And then one of the, very, very sweet and lovely members of the church came up to him afterwards and said, Father, why did you take away our flag? And he said, that was the kind of question nobody in seminary teaches you how to answer. And there was another very elderly lady in the church who could still remember hearing, before the war, her father had owned a plantation and enslaved people, and she could remember hearing them working in the fields during the day. So when he started his ministry, this was still living memory. And I think that exposure to Pinopolis, which is one of the places where the very old South was very strong, did really kind of create a real confrontation for him with history.
I knew that Lauren was especially interested in Stevens. So while I was working on the book, I actually took some of the chapters and I adapted them into academic articles. And I got them published, one in the Journal of Anglican Studies and one in Anglican and Episcopal History. And when I submitted the manuscript to Anglican and Episcopal History, the editor sent me a note and said, "Oh, I knew Lauren well. I loved Lauren. I'm willing to publish anything that Lauren wrote." And I thought it reminded me of the joke that lawyers often tell when I was practicing law. They said, a good lawyer knows the law and a great lawyer knows the judge. I just felt like having a journal editor that said, I'll publish anything that Lauren wrote. I was like, okay, we're home free. Yes, sir.
Among your last conversations that you had with Lauren, did he express to you what he hoped would be the single most crucial takeaway from this book, and how close do you think you came to achieving that?
Wow, we always save the hard questions for last, right? No. That's a great question. you know, the conversations that I had with him were mostly him trying to get me to take on the project. So we didn't get into a lot of substance. What little substance we got into, he was trying to persuade me, this is not theology, this is not church history, this is not dueling Bibles, you know, as I said before. I want you to take these three men, and I want you to draw lessons from their lives. And that's about where we left it. And I feel like, you know, that's what I did. Or that's what I did the best that I could. And that's the way I left it with him. I said, if there's nobody else to do it, you know, I'll do it. But it'll end up being as much me, or maybe more me than you. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Regarding that question, I just started the book, but on the very first page of the first chapter is this one sentence. The pressing question for each man, meaning of the three, was how the church should respond to changing times and how a conscientious clergyman should minister to the diverse communicants. And I thought that was kind of a important sentence. And to me, hearing the overview that you presented, thank you, addressed something that was implicit in everything, like the word ministry is in the title. But I didn't hear too much wrestling with what the definition of ministry is.
Mm-hmm.
In the three little biographies, the overview, Peter Stevens crossed the line. He followed Jesus. The other two wrestled with finding ways to support the institution of church.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that observation to me goes back to that question of the purpose of the book.
Yeah. You know, I think all three of them thought they were fulfilling their ministries. They just had very different understandings of what that was. Yeah. Yeah.
But like you pointed out in that story,
Yeah. Porter.
the rationale for not freeing the slaves that embodied the natural tension of following Jesus versus our conflicts of interest in living.
Well said. Yeah. Yes, sir. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? All great questions. So, Brooks, are we ready to adjourn then? I'll turn it back over to you.
Mike, thank you again. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Babs, you want to say a word about the reception and what we're going to do next? And then I'd like Ann to make final comments.
So you're all invited to come back and have some cookies and talk to folks. And there are books back there. There's also a table from the Reconciliation and Racism group, and I think Kathy's there to talk to you if you have any questions about what's going on today in the diocese in that area. And there are also some posters along with some history of both Dad and the group that he talked about. And I think Lynn put those together, and that's really nice. So come have some cookies, meet Mike. You know, we got lots of stories, and so love to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
If I say, "O Lord, make speed to save us. O Lord, make haste to help us," we are not done with this work. So the greatest tribute that we can pay to Lauren and the many of us who have found ourselves, what's the right thing to do today? And who will all follow and how we get there? We stumble, we fall, we're all in it together. But, oh God, make speed to save us. Oh Lord, make haste to help us. Let's stay in this together. Let's keep this work going. Thank you for coming tonight. Now let's go have some fellowship.